Eric Satie, the French composer, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Yes, a massive march across France. Close to 4 million people took place. That march took place 2 days after the gunmen who attacked Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine, Sharif and Saeed Kouachi, were killed by police after a siege at a printing works following a 3-day manhunt. Minutes after the print shop assault, police broke a second siege at a kosher supermarket in eastern Paris. 4 hostages had already died there, and the police killed the gunman, Amedy Coulibaly. France has announced it's deployed 10,000 soldiers on home soil and posting almost 5,000 extra police officers to protect Jewish sites, some 700 Jewish schools. On Friday, Sharif Kouachi said he received financing by the Islamic cleric Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. He had made the assertion on a television station before his death. Reuters is reporting both brothers who carried out the attack against Charlie Hebdo traveled to Yemen in 2011 and had weapons training in the deserts of Marib, an al-Qaeda stronghold. Meanwhile, a source within al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, has provided the website The Intercept with a full statement claiming responsibility for the Charlie Hebdo attack. Jeremy Scahill was the source of information in this country about that. Jeremy, talk about what we know about these attacks.
Well, I mean, first of all, there is a built-in motivation for a lot of different groups to try to take responsibility for these kinds of attacks, because there's a turf war going on between ISIS, the Islamic State, AQAP, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, old school central al-Qaeda, which is a very different organization now than it was under bin Laden, now that Ayman al-Zawahiri is in charge of it. France has been actually fighting its own war in Mali and elsewhere in Africa, using drone strikes and attacks and supporting the United States, battling against al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So we have to take everything that all of these groups say about this, with a great deal of skepticism. But what is clear to me, both from the reporting that we've seen at other news outlets and also from my own sources, is that AQAP, at a minimum, had these brothers in a camp, a training camp in Yemen, provided them with training, discussed with them, I understand from sources inside of Yemen, the idea that they should be attacking media outlets that have published the image of the Prophet Muhammad, particularly those that have published the image of the Prophet Muhammad in a demeaning or what they consider to be a disgraceful manner. The context of this, Amy, is that in June of 2010, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula released its first issue of a glossy, very fancy designed magazine in the English language called Inspire. And in that magazine, they had an image that was centered around the idea of a cartoon crusade. And they called on Muslims in the West to avenge the reputation and the sanctity of the Prophet Muhammad by going and killing cartoonists who were participating in a Draw Muhammad Day. And the show, South Park on Comedy Central, did a whole issue about this where they mocked the Prophet Muhammad. And they actually published a list of cartoonists, some of the cartoonists that had drawn the Prophet Muhammad in this manner, including a woman in Seattle, Washington named Molly Norris. And she had to go underground and change her name and received federal protection from the FBI. And I think to this day she still is underground, believing that she remains on this hit list. So this was something that was a major campaign initiated by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And my understanding is that these two brothers were doing this in concert to some degree with AQAP. Now, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula officials have told me that we directed this attack. That's very...
How did they get in touch with you?
I mean, I don't want to discuss, as the CIA says, I don't want to discuss sources and methods, but I will say this about this source. I've spent a lot of time in Yemen, including in areas controlled by al-Qaeda, and I would never just print something that I received from a random person whose identity I couldn't verify. Also, this isn't a source that just popped out of thin air for this story. This is the source of this information is someone that in the past has given me information about what al-Qaeda was going to say, or the fact that al-Qaeda was holding particular hostages before it was made public as a way of validating that they, in fact, do have access to the highest levels of debate and discussion within the leadership of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But I should say, just by way of context, well-placed sources within AQAP saying this is not an official statement from the leadership of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And before we go sort of all in and say, yeah, this definitely was AQAP that directed this plot or financed this plot, the normal way that AQAP would validate this would be to release statements and audio or video recordings through their official media channels. They have their own online television station. They have their own way of releasing things on discussion boards. Over the past year, they've started to shift more to Twitter in terms of announcing, making pronouncements or announcing actions that they've taken, hostages that they've taken, assaults or raids inside of Yemen that they've conducted. So what I'm going to be looking for in the coming weeks is if there's a martyr video that was filmed in Yemen by either of these brothers, or if AQAP is able to produce photographs of them at a training camp. That's what happened when Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib tried to blow up the airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. After that happened, AQAP eventually took responsibility, and then they began to release media showing, hey, this guy was with us in Yemen, and they actually released a martyr video where Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, this young Nigerian man, explained what he was going to do and why he was going to do it. So until that happens, I think that what we have here is a very reliable source in terms of accuracy within AQAP saying this, and now the U.S. is saying that they believe that their working assumption is that AQAP was involved.
Now that the so-called underwear bomber, it's just coming out now, actually shared a room in Beirut, Lebanon, with Koulibaly, the kosher supermarket shooter.
Well, I mean, my understanding is that both Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib and at least one of these brothers spent time at Iman University in Sana'a in Yemen, and that's a university founded by a cleric named Zindani, who is a very, very famous radical Yemeni preacher. He denies that he has any ties to terrorism, but his message is definitely in sync, more or less, with groups like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And John Walker Lynn, for instance, studied at that university. It definitely is a place where people go and then somehow find themselves going to training camps inside of Yemen. The idea that they would have been there at the same time, if in fact everything we understand to be true about these brothers is true, would not be surprising at all.
So you were in Yemen, you were investigating the drone killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, as well as his son, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, who was 16 years old, born in Denver. Talk about these connections that they're talking about right now, the actual meeting that al-Awlaki had with one of the brothers.
Allegedly, yeah. Well, first of all, just to give context on who is Anwar al-Awlaki, New York Times had a front-page piece on this over the weekend. The Washington Post had a big piece on it. CNN is now running this big profile of Anwar al-Awlaki. And a lot of what is being said about Anwar al-Awlaki in the media is sort of what Stephen Colbert called truthiness, where, like, it's sort of true, they're kind of getting it right, but there are tremendous factual inaccuracies that actually are very relevant to understanding any potential role played by Anwar al-Awlaki here. First of all, Anwar al-Awlaki was an American citizen who was born in the United States. His father was a very well-respected, is still alive, very well-respected Yemeni diplomat and scholar who got his master's degree in the United States and intended to live in the U.S. And then the family went back.
He was a Fulbright scholar.
He was a Fulbright scholar, and he also he had multiple master's degrees in the United States and remains a very dignified, respected member of Yemeni society. And
Anwar al-Awlaki's father.
This is his father, Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki. And so the family is here for some years. Then Nasser al-Awlaki goes back to Yemen because he was a water specialist and engineer and tried to help deal with the crisis of water shortage in Yemen, which is perhaps the greatest threat facing Yemeni society right now. Not terrorism, but its lack of actual potable water. So the family moves back there. Anwar al-Awlaki was young. He goes to school there at a bilingual school with the elite of the elite in Yemen. In fact, he went to school with the future head of Yemen's intelligence agency, who would be one of the main collaborators with the United States in trying to hunt down and kill Anwar al-Awlaki in a drone strike. Al-Awlaki then returns to the United States, goes to university in Colorado, was not a particularly religious guy. becomes sort of radicalized by the Gulf War in 1991 when George H.W. Bush ordered the invasion and bombing of Iraq in response to Saddam Hussein's incursion into Kuwait. And al-Awlaki starts to become involved with anti-war activities, ends up going to a local mosque on an invitation to speak there, and becomes interested in the idea of actually becoming a religious scholar and studying to be an imam. And so his life takes a dramatic shift, and he ends up becoming an imam. He and his family, at this point, he gets married. He's in San Diego. Two of the 9/11 hijackers were people that had been at his mosque. The 9/11 Commission determined that al-Awlaki didn't have any sort of conversations with them beyond clerical conversations that like a priest would have with a parishioner somewhere in the Catholic Church. But nonetheless, that's something that keeps being brought up, that al-Awlaki had connections to the 9/11 attackers. If we want to talk about that and say that that's evidence of something, we should also mention that at a time when 9/11 attackers were going to mosques where al-Awlaki was the imam, al-Awlaki was also invited by the Pentagon shortly after 9/11 to give a lecture at a luncheon at the Pentagon. And he, in fact, went to the Pentagon at the invitation of a senior Pentagon official and gave a lecture about the state of Islam in the world today. Al-Awlaki was clearly angered by the U.S. invasion of Iraq. He defended the right of the United States to go into Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda and denounced al-Qaeda as fake Muslims. This was all in the aftermath of 9/11. He was on NPR. He was profiled in the Washington Post. He was considered a legitimate part of the commentariat in the United States post 9/11 as a person who was brought on TV shows to make sense of the position of Muslims in the world post 9/11. And part of the reason he was invited on these media outlets is because he was condemning al-Qaeda. He was condemning the invasion he was condemning the use of Afghanistan as a base to plot the 9/11 attacks. Then Iraq gets invaded. Then Abu Ghraib happens. Then we start to learn about CIA torture sites around the world. We start to see Muslim prisoners in orange jumpsuits with hoods being brought. Then there's desecration of the Quran that happens. And you could see al-Awlaki becoming radicalized by these policies. And he goes back to Yemen and basically didn't know what he was doing with his life. He got involved with some real estate and other things. Then he basically starts using YouTube and the internet as his online mosque. He already was known around the world for sermons he had recorded on CDs. And part of the reason he became so popular in the Western world is because not only was he fluent in both English and Arabic, but he spoke in the language of the street. He would make pop cultural references. He would sort of mimic the way that Malcolm X spoke in terms of his riffs and other things. He would make references to international football teams and matches and make comparisons with, when you're trying to spread the religion, you don't wait to show up like the post office. You want to go at it like FedEx. And he would sort of, he was a guy who I think had an appeal to particularly younger Western Muslims. And, I listened to many days worth of Anwar al-Awlaki's preaching. And up until the invasion of Iraq, there was very little that you could look at and say, oh, here's a guy who's going to be very anti-American. In fact, al-Awlaki supported the war in Yugoslavia. He was on the same side as the United States in Bosnia. And in fact, al-Awlaki was calling for Muslims in the United States to fight the jihad against the Catholic forces of Croatia and the Orthodox Christian forces of Serbia, and he was on the same side as the United States. The U.S. was raising funds to arm Bosnian Muslims to fight in that war. The U.S. was on the same side as Anwar al-Awlaki and Osama bin Laden in the war in Yugoslavia in terms of the position that they staked out on Bosnia. Once al-Awlaki starts, though, preaching against the U.S. wars and saying that Muslims have a right to fight the jihad against the United States, he became a public enemy, similar to what the U.S. did with Saddam Hussein. When he's our guy doing our kind of repression, we want him. But if he crosses that line and affects U.S. or international oil interests, he's now tantamount to Hitler. That's similar to what happened with al-Awlaki. The U.S. then has al-Awlaki put in prison inside of Yemen for 18 months, where he was held in solitary confinement for 17 of those months. He was interrogated by the FBI while in that prison. And then when he released, he was a totally changed man.
Where was he held?
He was held in a political prison inside of Yemen, in Sana'a, Yemen. And in fact, I reported in my book that when the Yemeni government wanted to release al-Awlaki, that John Negroponte, who at the time was a senior counterterrorism official under the Bush administration, and of course one of the butchers of Central America during the 1980s. John Negroponte had a secret meeting with Bandar Bush, the Saudi diplomat very close to the Bush family, where he and the Yemeni ambassador, where John Negroponte said, our position is that we want al-Awlaki kept in prison until all of these young Western Muslims forget about him. This is a U.S. citizen who is being held in a prison in a human rights violating country on very flimsy charges that he had intervened in a tribal dispute, and a senior U.S. official intervenes to say, we want our citizen kept in your prison without any trial for 5 years until people forget about him. When al-Awlaki eventually was released, he was a totally changed man and began increasingly to cross the line from praising people fighting against the United States in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, to actively calling on people to come and, as he put it, fight on the fronts of jihad in Yemen or elsewhere, or in your own country. And this is where he really became considered to be a significant threat by the United States, that his words, not his actions, but his words, were going to inspire lone wolf acts of terrorism inside of the United States. And when he really rose to international prominence was in November of 2009, when Army Major Nidal Hasan, who was a U.S. military psychiatrist that had petitioned to try to have some of his patients prosecuted for war crimes after they described to him what they had done in Afghanistan and elsewhere, Hassan had written
this is at Fort Hood.
This is at Fort Hood, Texas. Nidal Hasan had written to Anwar al-Awlaki a number of times praising al-Awlaki, offering to give al-Awlaki like a human rights prize of $5,000. Al-Awlaki writes back to him and says, give it to the orphans and widows. Al-Awlaki basically was treating Hassan like kind of a disturbed character. But if you read media accounts today about Anwar al-Awlaki, they say he directed the Fort Hood attack. The declassified emails that the U.S. government has declassified between Anwar al-Awlaki and Nidal Hasan do not show that at all. In fact, they show Nidal Hasan as sort of an unstable stalker who's trying to get al-Awlaki to like him, and al-Awlaki is sort of dismissing him. Now, was Nidal Hasan inspired by Anwar al-Awlaki's preaching and teaching to do what he did at Fort Hood? Absolutely. No question whatsoever. Anwar al-Awlaki was clearly saying, and al-Awlaki in the aftermath praised it, and said what Nidal Hasan did was right, but I didn't tell him to do it. And al-Awlaki was not a guy who wouldn't claim responsibility for things that he actually did. He admitted that Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib was one of his students. Now, that could mean something very serious. It could mean that he was a student and he said, hey, to do something like AQAP wants you to do, to try to blow up this airplane, is acceptable under Islam because they're attacking us, and under these codes of the Sharia, it's fine to do. But to say someone directed a plot, in the case of the underwear bomber or in the case of Fort Hood, that's just not proven. And if we want to say that we live in a society based on the rule of law, if there's all this evidence that al-Awlaki was operational within al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, why did the United States never charge him with a crime? If I were a prosecutor, I would have tried to indict Anwar al-Awlaki for directly threatening the life of this American cartoonist in Seattle. Why was he never indicted? We indicted Osama bin Laden. We indicted John Walker Lynn. Why would they not indict al-Awlaki if all of this evidence that the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN now today claim that the U.S. has had for a long time? Why was there never an indictment of Anwar al-Awlaki? Why did the President of the United States serve as judge, jury, and executioner of an American citizen? Why did the United States advocate for a human rights abusing government to have one of their citizens placed in prison for indefinite detention when he hadn't yet been charged with a crime by the United States?
Well, what's the answer?
Well, I think that the U.S., on the one hand, was afraid of al-Awlaki's words. They didn't want to give him a platform in a trial. I think they also wanted to continue to be able to monitor him to see who he was working with and who he was meeting with. And I ultimately think that that the calculus was, if we were to capture this American citizen, this is not the same as putting Osama bin Laden on trial. This is not the same as putting Khalid Sheikh Mohammed on trial. This is an American citizen who speaks very articulate, fluent English, and would probably have an incredible defense team. So I think part of it was that they never wanted him to see a day in court. Now, I found al-Awlaki's words and his involvement with a number of people who went on to commit acts of terrorism or mass violence reprehensible. That's not the point here. The point is, if you're going to make these allegations, you better be able to prove it. So if al-Awlaki did, in fact, meet with either or both of the Paris shooters, that's a relevant part of this story. But what I know from my reporting on the ground about the underwear bomber is that Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib was a deranged young man. And AQAP wanted to make sure that he followed through on his plot. And my understanding is that they brought Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib to Anwar al-Awlaki to essentially either groom him or to act as a sort of Islamic therapist who was sort of trying to get his mental health back up so that AQAP could do what they wanted to do with him. That's my understanding of the role al-Awlaki played with AQAP, is that he was a guy who would help facilitate these people going to AQAP, but not that al-Awlaki was picking the targets or running the show.
We have to break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about Sharif and Saeed Kouachi, about Amadi Coulibaly. Now the French government and governments around the world are looking for Ayat Boumediene, the woman who they say was related to Amadi Coulibaly. Not clear exactly what her role has been. They say she left France, went through Turkey, possibly is in Syria. And the person who's fallen off the map is the 18-year-old Hamid Murad. The day of the attack on the satirical magazine, on Charlie Hebdo, they said that he was driving the car, but he turned himself in and said, I was in class, and many of his classmates tweeted this same fact. We haven't heard about him again. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.